Buenas tardes, good afternoon. My name is Bernard Gordillo, and I'll be talking a little bit about my CMS grant project. I would like to thank the Siquan Band of the Kumeyaay Nation for the honor of being a guest on their territory. As a mestizo immigrant from Central America, I present my research today as a grateful recipient of a grant from Critical Mission Studies. I would like to thank the California Indian Research Partners, Critical Mission Studies Coordinating Committee, and California Indian Advisory Board for this unique opportunity. I would also like to thank Chairman Valentin Lopez, Dr. Jonathan Cordero, and Dr. Stanley Rodriguez for allowing me to consult with them over many, many months. I'm especially grateful to the Amawutsun Tribal Band for their support. My grant project explores the California mission bell as a historically sonic and visual phenomenon. From the church bells that once rung, or still ringing, at the missions and their weaponization during Spanish colonization, to the appropriation and dissemination of the mission bell as a contested emblem of California's state identity and heritage. I study this phenomenon, and I came to bring the sonic and visual together in the notion of the bellscape, or the relationship of the mission bell to the land, as a singular embodiment of a landscape marked by mission bell sounds and symbols. My presentation today is a continuation of the one I gave at the Critical Mission Studies Conference in Santa Cruz this past August. I will briefly summarize those findings now for you. Then I focused on situating the function of the church bell and its sound prior to the colonization of California and within the mission period. Three concepts guided my exploration: sound, motion, and timekeeping. The mission bell emitted sonic signals. It was set in motion in order to ring, and it functioned to mark time in the perpetuation of the church calendar. Characterized by the sight and sound of bells hanging from a tower, wall, or gallows, the mission sensorium was central to the oppression and enslavement of Native peoples forced to undergo Christianization within its bounds. Moreover, even in silence, the mission bell loomed as a latent sonic presence and an implicit threat of force. It was thus a key tool for the establishment and maintenance of colonization. Its origins in California went well beyond the keeping of time. Indeed, it underscored mission violence and annihilation. With this in mind, and moving into today's presentation, I will explore the mission bell as a haunted vestige of Spanish colonization that endures as a problematic symbol of California's state identity and heritage. The converse of mission bells, most if not all derivative symbols, whether as two or three-dimensional constructs, are purposefully silent, static, and mark no time. They are otherwise theatrical props imbued with new meaning, false truths, or narrative revisionism divorced from the historical record. In this brief exploration, I draw from philosopher Jean Baudrillard's notion of the simulacrum as an image that, quote, masks and denatures a profound reality, end quote. Having been removed from their original context and become ahistorical reference, I would suggest that all simulacra of the mission bell are maleficent, evil material apparitions in their many guises seen across California and found in private and government projects, local and state. I will examine three of the most visible and prominent of the mission bell simulacra to haunt California: the El Camino Real Bellmark, the rain cross symbol of Riverside, and the mission bell and the Mission Revival Bell Tower. The El Camino Real Bellmarker is the emblem named after the modern reconstruction of the road supposedly based on the Spanish colonial routes that once connected the missions. The emblem is a physical manifestation of various social and commercial processes that began during the last decades of the 19th century, including the promotion of state tourism, resettlement to California from elsewhere in the US, and civic service by elite social groups. The modern El Camino Real arose from these as part of various revival and preservation movements associated with mission myths and imaginaries that would be absorbed into official state heritage narratives. This postcard brings together a now familiar romanticized story of the missions and its inscription onto a select map of the early highway system. The bell marker appears as a ghostly reddish silhouette on the right-hand side. its relative transparent looming behind the text itself. Established as the emblem of the modern road, the image is a haunting reminder of this symbol as a surrogate for the missions that adorns the route. Hundreds of bell markers were cast throughout the 20th century, a project begun and maintained by elite social groups, local and regional, and later inherited by their successors, in addition to the California Department of Transportation, Caltrans. These private and official efforts resulted in the commodification and industrialization of various generations of bell marker made of metal or cement, of significant weight and hung from a post resembling a crozier or crooked guidepost. The bell marker was made to withstand the pounding of weather and vandalism, yet as we saw in Santa Cruz not long ago, there are limits to the latter. To complete the visual aesthetic, the markers were painted in part or whole to protect the metal, and in some cases the bell was treated to give it a rusted or antique appearance. Writing tends to accompany each marker. In particular places, on the bell, on a road sign attached to the post, or in a small plaque on or near the post noting the social organization responsible for its presence. Although the writing reinforces the meaning and self-defined legitimacy of the simulacrum, it may be superfluous, as the mission bell image is all that is needed to convey a message of the staking of the land with such a symbol of violence. The small plaques fixed in place by social groups are of particular interest in that they denote a certain arrogance in taking responsibility for such a strange civic act, belying a neo-colonial gesture. At present, the bell markers continue to line the roads and highways between the missions, though there are significant gaps heading south on Highway 1, in between San Rafael and San Jose, and the connection of the 101 to the I-5, in between downtown Los Angeles and San Juan Capistrano. Highway expansion projects and local changes in infrastructure have either displaced or removed the markers once intended to be permanent. However, along a stretch of the 101 south of downtown Los Angeles, the dividing wall has been branded with a mission fantasy design displaying a belled wall. All of the missions have had their bell markers installed on their grounds, from 1 to 4 prominently displayed in their public areas, typically found on the main road out front of a given site. Here are a couple of examples: Mission Soledad, San Luis Rey, San Francisco Solano. In cases of multiple markers, they are also located in proximity to the Mission Church, as we saw. Mission Santa Cruz is the only site free of the marker, yet a vestige remains, pictured here. A small plaque next to the remnant of a post cut in half by Black Lives Matter protesters in 2020 produced this vestige. At other missions, the bell markers have found somewhat different uses. At Mission San Diego, the 4 lining the drive up to the mission double as street lamps. The bell marker has apparently found an indispensable purpose beyond the symbolic as a pragmatic tool. Similar to the bell marker, the rain cross symbol of Riverside developed as a result of a project to exploit mission myths for commercial purposes. The symbol accompanied the construction of the Glenwood Mission Inn, today the Mission Inn Hotel and Spa, in downtown Riverside during the first decades of the 20th century. Local entrepreneur Frank Miller built a hotel resort as a fantasy mission experience and tourist destination where mission revival architecture reached a pinnacle of access and density in a single structure. A member of the Landmarks Club, which had been founded as a mission preservation group, Miller sought to capitalize on romanticized narratives of the missions and the Franciscans. The monstrous result dominated Riverside's downtown, and still does in some way. The hotel took up an entire city block and comprised several wings, the first of which was a multi-story mission-inspired building with a bell arch out front. The arch had been a free adaptation of the bell wall at Mission San Gabriel. In general, the mission bell was among the more pervasive decorative features found throughout the building. With the establishment of the Mission Inn came the rain cross symbol as its emblem. Miller designed a symbol that brought together, quote, a replica of the mass bell used by Father Junipero Serra and the cross to which the Navajo and Central American Indians prayed for rain, end quote. Much like the excess and density of the hotel itself, the symbol was a distorted reflection of Native culture and mission fantasy, a simulacrum partially connected to the region, yet as an appropriation in the service of Miller's financial interests. The association of the bell to a Serra imaginary, supporting Serra imaginary notwithstanding, the bell and frame bear a remarkable resemblance to the largest bell and supporting wooden beams found on the bell wall at Mission San Gabriel. The mission bell appears to be a closer inspiration than the tale about Serra's bell. Miller not only designed the rain cross symbol for the Mission Inn, but he gave it to the city of Riverside, which has employed as its icon for over a century. This is the ubiquitous symbol found throughout the city. Other local Spanish period-style landmarks complemented the Mission Inn. Miller installed a mission bell hung from a gallows and a wooden so-called Serra cross on top of Mount Rubidoux. Located on an expanse of property he owned near downtown, the two features were extensions of the hotel's mission fantasy, yet with more clearly delineated religious purposes. The Serra Cross, in particular, has been a gathering point for an annual sunrise service since the first half of the 20th century. In addition to the two landmarks atop Mount Rubidoux, the bridge situated at its base, which crosses over the Santa Ana River, a former principal approach into town from Los Angeles, took the Mission Bell Tower as a design feature. 4 towers welcomed motorists to Riverside and prepared them for a full mission fantasy experience. Only the Serra Cross remains, currently mired in local political controversy of these 3 local landmarks. At a great distance from the missions and of little immediate historical relevance, private and government economic interests promoted mission myths as a form of public history, while extending the modern El Camino Real much further inland. The bell marker can also be found in Riverside, within the Mission Inn, donated by the Knights of Columbus in the late 1990s. It's there, so the right center. In turn, the rain cross symbol of Riverside can be found at the missions. On field research this past summer, I discovered the symbol on a functional bell next to the chapel at Mission Soledad. So we have the bell marker on the right, and then the little bell hanging from the structure at left. Zoom in. So we find the rain cross bell symbol. The El Camino Real map thus folds in on itself, increasing the layers of mission myths, further distorting the relationship between the cherry-picked mission history and tourism's boilerplate. Although the bell marker and rain cross symbol are simulacra of the mission bell, it is in the Mission Revival bell tower design that the bell haunts in its physical absence. The birth of the Mission Revival architecture movement bestowed physical shape and form on California's modern identity in the last decades of the 19th century. Drawing closely from mission architecture and more strongly from Spanish Romanesque and Moorish styles, Mission Revival caught on in the private and public imagination. Stylized facsimiles of mission courtyards, arcades, bell towers, and quatre-fois windows formed part of a novel canon of mission design elements. A construction boom disseminated the style and gave the state a nebulous Spanish character. In encapsulating this phenomenon, scholar Roberto Linsagarena has noted, quote, like the Greeks, Southern Californians had developed an architecture that would connote their identity and reinforce their invented historical traditions, both for themselves and to outsiders. In short order, the architectural forms of the Mission Revival would become visual shorthand for Southern California itself, end quote. Among these forms, the Mission Bell and Bell Tower emerged to also serve as a kind of visual shorthand. Whereas mission bells once proliferated as symbols and souvenirs of the state's invented heritage, the bell tower design pervades as a feature in private and public buildings and allude to the mission bell. With every appearance and suggestion of the bell tower comes a haunted echo of the missions and their bells, a reminder of how deeply the architecture defines California and how far the reckoning with its violent origins may need to extend. By way of conclusion, I would like to present a final reflection on a mission bell found in the courtyard of Mission San Carlos. Referred to as the Ave Maria Bell, the largest from the mission's collection that once rang in its towers, the instrument now sits on a raised brick pedestal as part of a monument to commemorate Junipero Serra. The writing in Latin on its surface reveals that an artisan by the name of Ruelas cast it in 1809. In fact, this part of the writing is in the first person. The bell actually says, Ruelas made me, giving agency to an otherwise inanimate object, a not unusual historical practice in which artisans sign their work. The writing conveys meaning and value to courtyard visitors. If we walk around the bell, more text appears, including a line from the biblical Psalm number 150, Laudate Dominum in cymbalis benesonantibus, praise God with well-sounding cymbals. This quote is an unintended ironic expression on this particular bell. This is one of the bells used by the Franciscans to maintain the enslavement and forced labor of native peoples during the mission. It fundamentally anchored the Christianization process. It rang no matter what as the accompaniment to native suffering and death. Its power to both frighten off evil spirits and gather people together, to echo R. Murray Schafer, was neutralized when removed from the bell tower and placed as a memorial. The sacred vessel that once sounded the voice of God then became mute. Now silenced, bolted down, and repurposed as a historical object alongside other religious fetishes within the courtyard, the Ave Maria Bell is no different than the bell marker or rain cross symbol. It is an original bell transformed into a haunted vestige, a simulacrum used as a grim reflection of violence, one of many thousands of mission bell vestiges that are so common in present-day California that they go unnoticed, hidden in plain sight, hardly worthy of comment. And yet each is a reminder of the root of genocide of the California Indians that began with the mission period. Each and every mission bell vestige thus serves as de facto endorsements for continued ethnocentrism and racism in California. Thank you.
My name is Cynthia Vasquez, and I'm a doctoral candidate in ethnic studies with a concentration in critical gender studies at UCSD. First, I want to acknowledge and thank Suquan, and also want to thank I want to give an acknowledgement that we're a Kumeyaay traditional territory, and I want to say thank you. I really want to start with that I'm currently finishing my dissertation titled Transporter Indigenous Education, Kumeyaay Education Sovereignty on the U.S.-Mexico border. I want to start with my story, a story about school. The trauma caused by schooling inflict profound invisible marks inside the bodies of youth. I witnessed these marks in the high school where I worked. The trauma inflicted on Native youth by the school officials were real. Blue eyes, known as the white administrators, teachers, gente de razón, several Native, and all students of color at the school. On the first day, I walked in as tribal community liaison in 2015 at Acorn High School. There was a position that was carved out by Title VII funds by 3 tribal governments, Campo, La Costa, and Manzanita. I briskly walked into the front office doors and saw those blue eyes follow me too. When I introduced myself to the youth as a tribal community liaison without exchanging any words, I felt they too saw those blue eyes. They were suspicious of me, and they saw me as one of the blue eyes. But what the youth did not know was that the blue eyes also surveilled me from a young age. As a young Chicana going to public school, I was always aware of how I was seen by white teachers in American society. In school, I was policed on how I talked, how I dressed, and who I was towards a goal of assimilation. To ultimately become an American, Many of us, Mexican Americans, react differently to the forced assimilation. Some of us overexcel in school. Others assimilate by losing their heritage, and some, like me, rebel. We talk back, we stand up, we are angry. My rebelliousness got me into a lot of trouble, and my parents dealt with it, as many parents do. In this case, immigrant parents say, si sigues portándote mal, I'll send you back to Mexico. Now, often they don't do it right, like they tell you, but they did with me. They sent me back to Mexico. And it just is a reminder of how, reminding me of disciplining, right? And disciplining the rebelliousness out of me as a young girl into a submissive woman. I start with this anecdote to situate my positionality and my background, but most importantly, to highlight how even under such violence done unto young brown girls, there is a fire inside us that burns down the mission school and burns down borders to regenerate and to reconnect with ancestral pathways. For this talk, I want to dedicate this talk to all the rebellious young girls. I will present a short snippet of Chapter 4 titled Transmissions, Hauntings, Ama de Llaves Aberrations in Contemporary California Schooling. So in this chapter, I focus on my critical ethnography work I conducted at an East County high school. The dissertation chapter does cover other details. It's about 60 pages long, but I won't make you go through it. I will only focus on a small part. I won't torture you. But, I want to talk about how I, kind of came to it. And I'm really expanding and thinking about hauntings when I was at the high school. And I'm expanding from sociologist Avery Gordon's concept of hauntings to invoke the cyclical ghosts of modern forms of dispossession and the modern systems of dispossessions of knowledge production. She defines a haunting as a meeting place and methodology to describe, write, and invoke. She quote, "The organized forces of order and violence, haunting is motivated by my desire to find a method, knowledge production, and a way of writing that could represent the damage and the haunting of the historical alternatives, and thus the damage and the haunting of the historical alternatives, and thus richly conjure, describe, narrate, and explain the liens, the costs, the forfeits, and the losses of modern systems of abuse, power in their immediacy and in worldly significance." In other words, hauntings engage with mission goals of the past and bring them to light by juxtaposing primary sources from Mission del San Diego Alcala, specifically diaries in California, testimonies from Eulalia Perez and Apolinaria Lorenza, with contemporary Native youth schooling experiences from my critical ethnographic reveals that even though schools continue to be damaging, which I don't need to go into, there are spots and places that are opening another portal where we can suspend the damage that is caused for many, many generations, even if it's temporary, in order to create a transformative space, a rebellious space. Historically, Ama de Llaves managed, maintained, and surveilled Indigenous peoples in the mission to uphold the gender norms to extract labor under European gender Christian ideologies. These concepts, I argue, fall under the larger umbrella of gente de razón, which I'm working through, or a person of reason. It's a framework that I'm teasing out. And so I trace these modern concepts of citizenship to gente de razón. Gente de razón logics, and I use this now to the modern concepts of citizenship to gente de razón logics in California, and how these logics are now used by schooling officials as a patronizing tool to push out Native students out of school and push them into the system, specifically the prison and social services, the carceral system. Even with these hauntings, students are utilizing the fire inside to reignite, and strengthen bonds, to support each other in navigating the educational pipeline. And by centering Native youth voices, specifically how Kumeyaay essential knowledges, because I work with two communities, specifically Campo and Juntas de Neji, they're burning down this mission, the school. And so the time I was there working with the kids, between 2015 and 2018, graduation rates increased from 5% to 20%. In the broader context, the fire burns down colonial borders, settler colonial, heteropatriarchy, and colonialism to really create another world. So let's see. So there are 3 research questions for this chapter specifically, but really I'm going to focus on the last just due to time, which is like, how does the community benefit from this work? And also the first question, how does the metaphorical, in some instances, the physical fire reignite, and strengthen bonds between Indigenous youth to support each other in navigating the educational pipeline to graduate? So my theoretical framework is that I'm using an Indigenous transporter perspective in education, as it's really rare in the literature, and I'm really thinking about this work, how it connects between transporter intertribal connections and are used as resistance to strengthen bonds. There is an urgency due to the political climate and immigration policies to examine the border and schooling practices as they relate to Indigenous transporter sovereignty, schooling, survivance, and resistance. So for example, how do state policies and militarization on the US-Mexico border affect border tribes? And how do school policies curtail Indigenous land-based knowledges, language realization efforts, and identity? And these questions propel my 7-year and overall tribally led, multi-site, community-based historical critical ethnography, I know ethnic studies do a lot of this, to get to this point, right? And so I draw from decolonial theory, native feminisms, and Chicana feminisms, and I use the border as a site to examine how overlap multi-settler colonialism, state surveillance, and hyper-militarization, carcerality, and state policies attempt to rupture Indigenous forms of education. And really what I ended up finding is the opposite. So instead of them trying to rupture these connections, they're actually strengthening. And so this is what I argue, that the foreigner or rebel discourse really originate from the mission and presidio apparatuses, and they operate today's settler schools, US and Mexico, to push Indigenous students into the prison pipeline. To disrupt the ongoing push-out rates, my work further reveal how implementing community and youth Indigenous-led Indigenous resurgences in school really break down 2 things, the physical and the metaphorical settler borders. They revitalize Indigenous traditions and customs while increasing high school graduation rates. My research pushes the current discourse in the field of education broadly and Indigenous education specifically to consider another contextual layer in which is transporter and intertribal relations. And most importantly, this work benefits Campo Band of Kumeyaay Indians and Juntas in the He threefold. First, this work identifies the causes of push-out rates in their community and highlights methods based on Indigenous pedagogies to support their youth in the US and in Mexico. 2, it strengthens intergenerational and inter-border bonds through language revitalization and land-based pedagogies that I've been doing in Mexico for about 8 years, maybe 9. And then the third is the finished product really stresses the urgency of how today's hyper-militarization of the border is really grounded in the mission apparatus and its methods of dispossession employed will continue not just in the school, but also outside. Okay, so now alternative spaces. I want to connect the past mission hauntings, and I'm going to center youth experiences in their community in high school. I want to illuminate how Indigenous youth envision and dream about and create an alter native space in their schools. I use an alter with an aim to change, modify, transform, gild, neuter, and cut. And I use the word alter with an A to denote ceremony, modify, sanctuary, and a place of refuge. Native spaces referenced here are influenced by critical Indigenous studies and education scholar Sandy Grande. She conceptualized alternative spaces in her seminal work, Red Pedagogy, as the 4th space grounded in Indigenous space, shaped by and through a matrix of legacy, power, and ceremony. Grande calls the altar with an E to change the settler coloniality landscape rooted in labor and land extraction, genocide, capitalist consumption. She further elaborates that the 4th space is reimagined as a transgressive space of both transience and permanence. Essentially, an altar with an E, native vision and schooling is not based on a multicultural, inclusive curriculum. So I'm not arguing here that we need to carve out these spaces in a very violent space. What I am arguing is that these spaces are here for survivance purposes to continue on navigating in this educational pipeline. It's also grounded calls for a transgressive change in survivance, lived experiences, connection to land, anti-capitalism, and community-based. So really grounding my experiences as connecting Ama de Llaves during my time as tribal liaison in relation with working with youth. So I've been missing a lot of stuff, but this chapter is really rich. I worked as a tribal liaison for 3 years, and when I walked into the high school, I was immediately placed as a disciplinary. As someone who's Chicana and working with Native students, you can see that that wasn't going to be my role. Okay, and so when I walked in, it took a while to understand where I was at, who am I, and so I kept seeing these visions of Ama de Llaves, and I thought, wow, isn't this very similar to what they did in the missions? And so these hauntings really came to me in my dreams, and they came to me when I drove up there, and when I came back. And so when I started working with the kids, it was really interesting because, a lot of them didn't know where I would fit, who was I, and was I going to report back to administration? Little did they know I wasn't going to do that. But I was there to really, ignite the fire, the rebelliousness, and really rise from the ashes of what an alternative Native space may look like from their perspective. They would carve out. So the youth experiences in the high school, I'm going to show some images here of the Native Pride Room. It comes from a transform and transgress and how they want to support by their parents, leaders, and administrators. And then intersecting ideas, experiences, and expectations illuminate how the fire inside the youth used to navigate the educational pipeline and burn a path for themselves. The path began with Native Pride, student-run organization, and extends beyond the organization into the school. Youth use Native Pride to imagine a fourth space, to create an Indigenous space, a place to belong, and support for one another, a place of ceremony. It took 3 years to burn that fourth space down, and it wasn't until the last year that, as a tribal community liaison, we built this relationship to come to fruition. Now, really following in on this vision and altering, scorching, fostering, and creating an alternative space, the students brought this to a completion in 2018. After 2 years of working as tribal community liaison with the students, I learned that from previous lessons and mistakes that my last school year with the students really stoked an urgency to create a space for them for resistance and safety. With time and consistency, the students' resistance became minimal. They came around, slowly changed, and momentum picked up and had permanent space in the school, a space they call their own. This alternative space sparked an uptick in student membership in Native Pride for 7 students to 20 students. Native students who were once ambivalent about school activities became involved in school politics and organization. Now again, I'm not saying this because of multiculturalism, but it was a form of them to push back and to resist and to gain more power. Yes, okay. Was it done? Oh, okay, well, okay, I'm gonna have to stop. Okay, let me kind of go back. All right, in conclusion, I missed a lot of stuff, but it's okay. Alternative Native spaces secured a level of safety for students to discuss with each other, and a lot of the negative stuff that was happening on campus. So I'll just go kind of quickly. They gained about during that year, we had a group of Native girls who were able to raise about $5,000. And through this, they ended up doing a lot of trips. Like we went to conferences, they invited tribal leaders. And then up here, this is the space that they actually ended up really defending until I left. Unfortunately, that was taken away from them. Because this is community work, there are recommendations that for the district to continue something like this. And of course, this would be particular to any community, but one thing is to actively recruit Native American teachers for each school, and two, not to touch Title VII funds, to actually institute these type of programs to support Native American students. And finally, to have contracts, long-term contracts. So we're talking about 4 to 5 years if a person wants to be in this position. Okay, great, thank you.
relatives, Ya Olita Tachich, Iyechan Inuwe, to Sequan Band of Kumeyaay for hosting and continuing to support cultural connection and the perpetuation of community. Much appreciation, Iyechan to Ralph Chrisman Sr., much heartfelt connection to him and his beautiful family. Iyechan to Mr. Steve Elster for supportive awareness and history of connection with our people. Relatives Anthony R. Pico, Barbara Leo, Kenneth Shelton Sr., and supportive entities like UCSD, Mr. Ross Frank, and my very dear friend here, Tamara Strohauer, for being a catalyst and supporting healing. To all the elders today here, Preston Arrowweed and his beautiful wife, Helena, to our ancestors and all our relations here today and forever tomorrows. May all the good work here today continue for the best interest of all. Heyai kome kuknup chnyali thachich. My late grandmother, Margaret Dora Pico, told me of times when as a child, her grandfather and relatives, mainly elders, would tell of stories, reflections of those before us. She provided the little translation for Haigai Kome Kuknach. Those that were here before us, and it all comes down to where we are today. Such is of our sacredness, healing, and understanding we exist within all our relations. It's within the stories of connection and heart we find our sense of view of the world, our place in the broader world. There exists the relevance of our lessons and experiences shared by those before us. I also want to share with you before we go into the slides, or before we go into the video rather, from that story of survival, the Hayai Koimut Kuknach, what I'm going to share with you is about 4 generations right now of that transference of knowledge. Anthony R. Pico, my uncle, acknowledged his grandfather, Thomas Hyde, nephew of Venturo Paipa. 1, 2. The Kumeyaay Trail of Tears, and we'll go into the history of Capitan and what I'm talking about, but there was a trail of tears here in San Diego, was the way he described the trauma of being evicted and moved to new land, without a home, water, or food, and ultimately, deaths of many. The demolition of a village protected within the larger El Capitan Grande Reservation was fought by his elders as an illegal act of confiscation and violation of federal law that deeded the land to the tribal villagers. The Indians lost. And for Uncle Tom, great Uncle Tom, it fueled a lifelong mission, which was to make the tribe strong and independent enough to protect it from future confiscation of reservation homelands. The story of perseverance and resiliency embodies values, tradition, connection, heartfelt desire to continue as a tribal people. Can we go to the slide with Mike? Okay, so there was 1 generation from Anthony Pico, Venturo Paipa. Here's Anthony Pico with the 4th generation right here. My son was able to give an interview with his great uncle regarding the experiences that happened in 1934 with the people and the removal of the Capitan Grande Mission Indians from Capitan to what is now Via Huss Reservation. And so they shared experiences with regards to this. So right there you see what my grandma was relaying, which is the Chaye Kome Kuknach, those that were here before us, and it all comes down to where we are today. And this transference of oral traditional knowledge through intergenerational connection and communication. We're not talking in books, we're not talking in, someone getting up and speaking, although it can happen in those forms as well. But that human connection and those human elements are really important to create those connections and that healing. And it's really rooted in that resiliency. And we can see it in our tribalism and the connection within our tribe. And this is the compilation of 3 interviews we did. And we did 3 interviews on separate days, and they actually ended up being 2 hours long which was fine with us because we want to get as much information, and we realized actually even within what we were doing that we would have a need to come back and loop back around because there was so much knowledge that was coming out of the interviews and so much that we could come back to go, okay, let's see here, let's look into this a little bit more. Let's go into this a little bit more in this specific topic. So anyway, thank you. So we also created a website to house a lot of our documentation, the information that we would be allowed to share. And so when that becomes available, we'll go ahead and initiate that for people who want access to more understanding and kind of what we're doing in this ongoing process. Thank you very much. Yeah, I appreciate your time.
So the question that I want to take up here is one that I think recurred in the opening conversations today about why the Catholic Church doesn't listen, or why the Catholic Church doesn't want to just tell the truth. And I guess my big takeaway, if you want to tune out for the rest of this, is that I think it tells itself a different truth or a different mythology about what happened. And that mythology is one in which the missionaries themselves were the ones who suffered and sacrificed themselves. And that suffering, along with the suffering of Indigenous peoples, is redemptive in Catholic theology. That suffering leads to salvation. On the Saturday morning between Good Friday and Easter Sunday, 1695, Father Francisco Javier Saita woke early, eager to prepare the culmination of Holy Week. Having arrived at his station in Caborca, Sonora, just months before, Saita had resisted repeated offers from his fellow Jesuits to spend the week with them at the more established missions of the Ave Maria Alta. He explained that he not only toiled piously with his Atham converts, but had so much physical labor that he could not spare the time. In March, Saita lamented to his mentor, Father Francisco, Father Eusebio Camino, "I will not enjoy your favors, for in reality I am swamped spiritually and temporally." By April, however, he had relented and promised Camino a visit sometime after the Paschal celebrations. Thanking him for a care package of letters, bread, and cookies, the new missionary excused his absence by expressing paternalistic concern. He explained that he was presently occupied, but would nevertheless steal a while, and like a swift arrow fly to put myself at your feet. Saita intentionally employed this image, the swift arrow, as a play on his family name, which meant arrow, in the missionary Castilian, as well as the Italian that he shared with Father Camino. Upon receiving the letter, Camino savored the pun. He noted that Saita invoked it wherever possible. How many countless times did I hear him say, "He has made me a chosen arrow," alluding piously to his name, Saita. This reference from Camino, I think, is a reference to this idea of God's providence, superintending these events, that even to the point of appointing a missionary, Saita, who would die by arrows. Weeks later, when the letter finally arrived, or when Saita finally did arrive at Camino's feet, he did so not as a swift arrow, but in a highly ritualized and deliberate procession. The only arrows were those collected in the reliquary that contained his remains. By the time Camino received the letter, just before Mass on Easter Sunday, it was too late. At sunrise on Holy Saturday, a group of 50 to 60 men from the missions of Tucutama, Oquitoa, Pitiquin had arrived in Caborca. Saita probably did not know that these Atam, and not Apaches or Hocomes, as Camino had first warned, had killed the Jesuits' Opata allies in Tucutama and burned its church. Typology and chronology mix in the diverse accounts of the ensuing events. Nevertheless, soldier, missionary, and native testimonies agree that Saita died soon after the group arrived on that morning, April 2nd, 1695, suffering at least 2 initial arrow wounds to his chest and absorbing other blows to the rest of his body. In addition to the missionaries, 6 native Christians, 4 Opata, 1 Seri, and 1 Atham were killed during Holy Week of 1695. While this initial uprising was episodic and local in character, cycles of violence spun outward in the following weeks. Indiscriminate Spanish reprisals and disproportionate punishments provoked a wider revolt, eventually leading to burned missions, retreating missionaries, and fleeing indigenous communities throughout northern Sonora. Camino reached out to allied Atham governors and agreed to meet with them in early June at a marsh called El Tupo to discuss the conditions of peace. Tragically, that gathering went horribly awry. When the Atham leaders produced some of the men whom they contended had been involved in the first uprising, a Spanish captain named Antonio Solis summarily executed one of them. In response to the sudden extrajudicial murder, several Atham began to flee. In turn, Spanish soldiers and Opata indigenous auxiliaries responded by discharging their weapons, reporting that they had feared an ambush. Since they had come to El Tupo unarmed and with the assurance of security, the assembled Atham endured heavy losses. 48 men and women died on June 9th at El Tupo, a place subsequently known as La Matanza, or the massacre. Unsurprisingly, more violent resistance spread throughout the summer of 1695, and angered Atham attacked the missions of Tucutama, Caborca, San Ignacio, Magdalena, y Muris. In strategic raids, Atham killed cattle, destroyed crops, burned churches, and desecrated sacred images. Grappling with dramatic setbacks, Jesuit writers relish prophetic tidbits like Saita's arrow pledge, eager to point to every sign that a martyred missionary had embraced his trial. To them, Saita's premonition of death helped demonstrate his sanctity. When placed in letters, vidas, histories, and reports, the omen transcended hagiographical anecdote and reinforced a shared sense of providential suffering between missionaries, Jesuit colleagues, novices, and indigenous converts. In the face of clear evidence of failure, these signs were meant to assure the surviving missionaries, their survivors and supporters, that this was not a failure, but was all according to God's plan. Far from unexpected, the Atham Revolt of 1695 was just another repetition in what they imagined was a divine pattern in which missionary and indigenous suffering seeded the future fruits of spiritual conversion and territorial expansion. In addition to present context and future payoff, these writers contended that Saita's death should be understood in biblical and historical terms, dating back to the ancient church, but replicated in colonial experience. Referring indirectly to the story of Joseph in Genesis, Camino explained that, quote, evildoers might serve their own causes, but the Most High permits it with his most divine providence, because even from evil, he knows how to rescue good. This reference to the patriarch Joseph insisted that God redeemed all suffering. Unsurprisingly, Camino quoted the church father Tertullian time and again to bolster his argument. He urged his superiors to trust in the belief that blood would seed new Christianity for the, quote, immense glory and celestial crown of the holy martyrs, and ut sanguis martyrum sit semen Christianorum, or the blood of the martyrs is the seed of Christianity. Camino believed this ancient logic had become the established pattern of redemptive death in northern New Spain. To bolster his case, he cited letters from fellow Jesuits and Spanish soldiers throughout, and he pointed to an agricultural metaphor that pervaded the epistles of his fellow missionaries and colonists, as all involved assured themselves that Saita's death and Atham suffering would not be in vain. Summarizing this overall sensibility, Father Antonio Menendez, the rector of the Mayo and Yaqui missions, optimistically reassured Camino that all missions begin with the blood of a minister. As evidence, Menendez cited the martyrdom of Father Tapia, Gonzalo de Tapia in Sinaloa. He also pointed to the deaths of Santarén and 7 glorious fathers among the Tepahuan, as well as Fathers Pascual, Martinez, and Chinipas, and Fathers Cornelius Bedun, Antonio Basilio, Diego Ortiz de Faronda, Manuel Sanchez, who had most recently graced the Tarahumara with their blood. From this longer view, the Pimerías missionaries should take solace because, quote, God was pleased that the further of Father Francisco Javier Saita would be the first fruits of that mission. Likewise, the Slovenian rector of Sonora, Marcos Antonio Capus, expressed his hope that bad would work for good. In the immediate aftermath of the news, Capus had written to profess his veneration for the region's, quote-unquote, glorious proto-martyr. He assured Camino that the Divine Majesty would look upon the sacrifice of the innocent victim and work all these evils to fructify greater and greater blessings, end quote. Surely, he concluded, the glorified Zaita would intercede on the mission's behalf and for protection and benefit. In their classic portrait of medieval hagiography, Saints in Society, Daniel Weinstein and Rudolf Bell made the ambitious claim that wherever Christianity encounters a frontier, it needs martyrs. Whether carrying the faith to infidel on heathen lands, combating encroachments of kings and princes, or fighting heresy in Europe, martyrs there would be. On the one hand, Weinstein and Bell were stating an obvious conclusion about the results of violent encounters in medieval Europe. On the other hand, the author suggested something more, that Christian stories, relics, and remnants of the faithful dead did something. They proved socially and politically useful in justifying the conquest and pacification of frontiers. Spiritually, they secured salvation of new nations, and practically, they fueled the expansion of Christendom. Death occurred in colonial borderlands for a variety of reasons, both mundane and unexpected. Like medieval Christians, however, Jesuits in New Spain elevated missionary deaths in stories of holy sacrifice to render them meaningful and useful. Martyrdoms could transform ruinous moments of disease or revolt into mysterious signs of progress. They operated temporally to mitigate setbacks and ensure future salvation. They also worked spatially to bring Christendom into being, sacralizing native territory with saintly blood. Passion stories, relics, maps, portraits, they all help transform indigenous spaces into Christian places in the European cultural imagination. In this work, martyrdom joined other naming rituals, meant to convert non-Christian territories by making the land holy. Like the orthographic practices that endowed indigenous settlements and sacred places with names of Catholic patron saints, martyr stories are part of what Daniel Repp has called a, quote, extensive process of inscribing the American landscape with Christian symbols and meaning, rendering both intelligible and tractable to Iberian imperial exploitation. In similar fashion to the atlases, parades, gardens, and performances described by Patricia Seed in her study of ceremonies of possession, martyrdom operated as a rhetoric and practice that laid claim to native land and fueled European expansion. Missionary and convert suffering marked this space with Christian blood and set it apart as destined for conversion. My book, Missions Begin with Blood, interrogates this assertion to trace how Catholic missionaries saw their work through the lens of a powerful agricultural metaphor. Although the imagery of Christian suffering as seed and convert salvation as fruit goes back to the early church, it developed new meaning in the context of the colonization of the Americas. 2 to 5, okay. Range there. Okay. The agricultural metaphor supplied a logic of ultimate productivity in the face of violent coercion and catastrophic setback. Seeds, weeds, water, fruit, and harvest variously captured stages of investment and return through which Catholic missionaries explain their own rituals and indigenous tribulations as ultimately redemptive. The idea that seeds must die and weeds must be choked out so that evangelism could bear fruit established what I call a redemptive economy that helped priests explain the losses involved with indigenous resistance or sickness as deposits in a spiritual system that would produce untold profits in the form of future conversion and further colonization. In an essay on modern suicide bombers, Talal Asad contends that idioms of redemptive death are foundational to the history of Christianity and ultimately to Western culture. For Assad, sacrificial death constitutes the necessary foundation for the West's capacity for violence and claim to territorial sovereignty. It also becomes the practice that distinguishes which lives count as fully human and therefore worthy of saving, and which are extinguishable. Dying to give life, Assad tells us, marks these cultural boundaries and authorizes the making of war. Though not exclusive to Christianity, this logic has proven powerful in the Christian West because the conviction that communal salvation requires individual sacrifice lies at the center of atonement theology. Assad argues, quote, in Christian civilization, the gift of life for humanity is possible only through a suicidal death. Redemption is dependent on cruelty, or at least on the sin of disregarding human life. The impulse to apply redemptive meaning from pain pervaded this Christian imagination, and I would argue still undergirds modern responses to violence. This dynamic drove Iberian imperial expansion and evangelistic enterprises in North America. Practices of martyrdom helped missionaries, soldiers, and magistrates translate conflict into terms that helped justify expansion of New Spain's northern borders. Together they made the unifying claim that native bodies, resources, and lands would only be secured through Catholic sacrifice. Martyrdom here becomes a site for competing interpretations of reality, some of which allowed cosmic explanations to override immediate material and physical reasons for suffering. In addition to the deaths of specific priests at the hands of rebellious converts, my book takes up this sacrificial motif that permeated these sources. By tracking that logic, this study offers an explanation for violent confrontations and repositions debates over religious change to focus on space and practice. Jesuit martyr discourse had a symbiotic relation to an attempted conversion of native peoples and the transformation of their religious spaces and practices. What should have been the ultimate sign of loving service in the Christian tradition instead helped justify forceful cultural change, physical discipline, and military intervention. In turn, these acts begot further cycles of confrontation, revolt, and attempted reduction. Though not the first to employ sacrificial narratives to sanctify territorial appropriation, early modern missionaries of the Society of Jesus mobilized their martyrdoms in a powerful way that ideologically empowered European and global ambitions. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you to all of our panelists today. We'll go ahead and open it up for questions. I do want to apologize because I think I forgot my manners at the airport. I didn't introduce myself today to you all. My name is Mary Lopez Kiefer. I'm a member of the San Luis Rey Band of Mission Indians. I'm also a proud member of the advisory committee for the Critical Mission Studies Project and the chair of the UC Office of the President's Native American Advisory Council. So excited to be here. So I would like to again say thank you to all of our panelists, and if there's a question, I don't know if I'm supposed to run the microphone to you.
I'll take care of it.
Oh, somebody else will do that? All right, we have a question right over there.
Thank you all for your presentations and for being here and sharing with us today. I actually have a question for Brendan while you're kind of in the hot seat. You shared with us competing narratives of suffering focused on Spanish missionaries. How did they frame native suffering?
Yeah, so there was a presentation earlier by Abel Gomez in the other room, and he had a picture of a cemetery there, and there was a sign that said, that had a name of an indigenous child who had died, the first one who had died at Mission Dolores. And it says, we offer her as our first fruits, or our first offering to heaven. And I think that really, when I saw it, I was like, that's it, that's the thing. It's that transposition. So the second chapter, I write quite a bit about Native children who died during plagues, really epidemic plagues. And this idea, they believe that was a good thing. Very similar to what you see, there was some of the sort of more conservative Catholic responses to revelations about residential schools in Canada, that ultimately they were saved, right? They were baptized and sent straight to heaven, but also that then they would become patrons in heaven that would intercede on behalf of the mission and would secure future harvests of Christianity. So yeah, it's pretty despicable, I guess. But I think it's pervasive, right? And to step back from that language and say, I think we all do this to some degree, right? We all think that that suffering always has a reason, right? Or we can fall into that. This idea that there's some kind of providential arc to it. And I think that can be tempting for us. And these are people that cultivated all sorts of practices around it.
Thank you. And by the way, Sarah does, in one of his letters, talk about, and almost begs to be one of the first ones.
Good timing.
Thank you.
Is there another one?
Oh, yeah.
I wanted to address my question. I figured it was Marietta Kiefer. Is it? Okay. I'm a former friar, so I got my degree in philosophy at San Luis Rey Mission in the 60s, okay? And we were given mimeographed scripts to read, and as you probably could imagine, back then it was about the Digger Indians, you know? It was a low level of civilization, blah, blah, blah. Well, it took me years to overcome those kind of beliefs and understand the tragedies and the atrocities that took place, okay? But my question to you is that why are the missions still telling lies? Why do you go, when I went to San Luis Rey Mission as a reporter, sat down with a bunch of 4th grade kids, you know, the docent there told the kids, well, you know, here's what the Indians ate. They ate acorns and they ate rabbits and so forth. But when the Franciscans came, they brought pigs and cattle and seeds for grain, and the Indians had better stuff to eat. My question to you is, why aren't there any norms or standards for the docents at these missions? Then I go to Santa Barbara Mission, and an elderly docent looks at us in a tour, and he says, during all the period of the missions, not one shot not one Spanish soldier fired one shot against the Indians. Well, we know that there were open rebellions, and then, as this gentleman says, these go back. The rebellions and the resistance goes back. So my question is, why under the Franciscan missions isn't there more control over what the docents say?
Just a little question.
How do you think? Oh, it does work. Well, thank you for that question. I am just a moderator. Oh, I know. But it's a question I actually find myself asking the mission San Luis Rey as well. We have not been collaborated with. Trying to build that relationship with the mission has been a long, arduous road. And in fact, earlier today, my sister, Carrie Lopez, spoke about trying to move beyond anger and trying to have a more respectful relationship with the mission. And really the first step is being able to develop with them their curriculum for their docents. Our own tribal members have been sorely disappointed in what the docents had shared. And they're able to access so many more young minds than we have been able to, and to tell the true stories. But again, this is a place that is owned still by the Catholic Church. It's not a public place. And I'm sure Professor Cordero would love to address the whole, there was no shot fired at Santa Barbara Mission. But I do appreciate your bringing the issue up because it is something that we struggle with as well because it's not our land anymore. We'd love for it to be back so that we can go ahead and tell that story, but it's still very much something we're working towards. Thank you.
One last thing I want to say. Does Mel Vernon and the others, people at the mission, ever discuss with the Franciscans what happened? I mean, when I go walk across those mission lands, I feel I'm walking on the bodies of those babies that died there, okay? That's the experience that I have. And this didn't happen overnight. I had to read and research and all that. But what are the Franciscans saying? Have you ever talked to them?
Go ahead, Karen.
Yes, that those conversations have been happening more.
They've been happening more often. The challenge is how does that translate into the actual scripts for specific docents and holding them accountable to it. Every time we make progress, they change. Every time we build up a capacity with the current staff at the old mission, they change. So we've got to keep up with a constant effort that competes with a lot of other needs, but you could actually be very insightful as to how we could better target, because we're obviously not doing well enough. Something's not sticking. So.
But the general question I have
Oh, that's okay. I mean, go ahead.
is where are, and this is my thought, okay, because I want to have some focus groups along the fires all over the province, okay? But where are their heads? What are they thinking? Do they agree with the total colonial narrative, doctrine of discovery? Are they proud of what the fires have done? Or are they beginning to question? I just have that question in my mind because I think it's important. I mean, I know Joe Chinichi, by the way, I know him. He was a classmate, and Mike, I know all these guys. So I think that it's important to start putting the focus on them, what they think, because they don't have a leg to stand on. Obviously, the food is all low hanging. He's saying it, everybody's saying it. You know, Jonathan says 1,000 deaths every year. Come on, you know. Anyway, sorry about my passion, but it's something to vote.
No, thank you.
Just one really quick question to you. So you knew Maynard back?
I lived in the same house with him, and Francis Guest was my professor.
Okay.
A brilliant guy, totally wrong. He wrote a book called Hispanic California, in which he justifies exactly as he said, why the Indians, when they were beaten, they were enjoying themselves with the suffering of Christ. Now, how sick is that, okay? So how do we, yeah, I do all of them, I do.
I have a question for Brandon Bain. So, it's just a question. So, obviously, in order for I call it the church, in order for the missions to happen, there had to be a lot of money. And there had to be an attempt to turn it into a money-making enterprise. Do you think that could be part of the reason why the church didn't listen? Because in part they didn't have to listen as long as they were making money.
The money question is really complicated, especially when it comes to Jesuits, because they ultimately get expelled and suppressed as an order over money, or with the fear that they're making too much money. They, of course, are always saying that they're destitute and, living, humbly. But I don't know. I mean, my take on it is they set up a system where they always win. So if they're making money and they're gaining converts, that's great. If not, if there's disease, setbacks, resistance, and they die, that's even better, right? Because martyrdom is going to secure the future growth. And so, yeah, I think financial gain is part of it. I mean, it's complicated, right? Because the Patronato Real, they're also getting paid by the monarchy, right? So it's not even just the church that's getting it. Monarchy is in control of the church in New Spain, and they're getting all their funds directly from the king or the viceroy or the governor.
But colonialism isn't only happening here, it's happening all over the world. And the church is getting more and more powerful. You can't even calculate that word. So why would you have to listen, even if you're hurting people terribly in that situation?
I mean, yeah, I think there are people that are, I mean, there's a whole range of motivations, right? There's certainly people that are just in it for direct financial gain. But I guess I'm trying to explain people who understand themselves as servants, understand themselves as somehow enacting the Christian gospel, and how they're reckoning with the violence, And I think it's through this language of martyrdom and this language of self-sacrifice. But I see there's been a hand there in the back for a while there. So.
Hi, my name is Mary. My question is for all the panelists, but it's in response to some of the information about Riverside and the Mission Bell there. I'm in the inland region, and the Mission Inn is like Disneyland of the mission system. It is a over-glorified theme park to attract thousands of people to the Riverside area to promote the idea of the missions as a beautiful, holy, and very money-making thing, And I think that collectively, I would like to know what we can do to stop the glorification of the mission system. I think telling the history is a part of it, but it's also like we have to stop the commercialization and over-glorification of all the missions and the mission system. And telling the history is a piece, but something more has to be done because it's not happening in the past. It's still currently happening, especially in communities like Riverside.
So, thank you for your question. With Riverside, the Mission Inn is directly tied to the city and the economic growth and flourishing of the city over the last century, even after Frank Miller dies, and the Mission Inn itself almost dies in the 80s, I believe. Then it was purchased and then revived, yet another revival. So beyond understanding the history, what can we do? Recently there was a ceremony at the Mission Inn to celebrate a bell, a local bell that came from a settlement, local settlement at the end of the 19th century. And it was a women's social group that had gotten together to celebrate this bell at the Mission Inn and displayed in one of its restaurants. And it was merely to celebrate the replacement of an old plaque, not even the bell. The organizations that funded that were the Mission Inn Foundation, the Native Daughters of the Golden West, women's social groups of one kind or another, both local and regional. The usual groups that have funded these micro ceremonies surrounding bells. And a chairperson from the city council was there to kind of put the stamp of approval or affirm that sort of act in some way. I would think that approaching council members will be one way to potentially start a dialogue. Right now, there's a controversy with the Santa Cross on top of Mount Rubidoux because Mount Rubidoux is now on land owned by the city. It's public land, you could say. And the Santa Cross, that plot, is owned by a separate private entity that the city sold the land to years ago in order to protect the permanence of the Santa Cross. Where it was once, let's say, on Frank Miller's property, it then was turned over to the city and eventually came under private hands. Potentially, there's something that there is progress to be had by engaging the council members. I was surprised to see the council member pictured with this ceremony at the Mission Inn because their partner studies First Nations culture. But that also means that this council member is ignorant of the history of the region of the California Indians and of what that bell really signifies beyond these elite social groups. So potentially it's about approaching the city council and reshaping the way the city tells its own history and what it centers and what it doesn't. Thank you.
I just just have a comment in regards to mission propaganda, whether it's a bench or a sign or anything of that nature, is not provided by the mission. They pay for nothing. It's a Native Daughters of the Golden West, or the 490 Club, or any women's organization usually who supports this entity of colonialism. And when I contacted the Native Daughters of the Golden West, they were just dumbfounded. They could not believe that we were going to put them on blast, if you want to say so, about their support of the mission system. So I think that a good place to start would be with these women's organizations. It's not that they don't know any better, it's just this is what they do. They make booties and gloves and so forth to earn money, and they get a lot of money. So all the propaganda that you see at these missions, whether it be plaques saying, you know, our faithful Indians or what have you, is supplied by these organizations.
He's on mic 2 now.
Okay, well, microphone's working.
Just want to say, oh.
Go back to your mic. There you go. Sorry.
Okay, microphone's working. Just want to say thank you again for everybody for coming today, and thank to each of our panelists for sharing your research with us, and if we could just have a round of applause.